The flight attendant's smile vanished when she saw the black teen in seat 3A. "This is first class," she said, her tone sweet but sharp. She snatched his ticket without warning, and silence swept the cabin, every stare loaded with judgment. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The cabin air was cool, sterile, with that familiar scent of filtered ozone and stale coffee. But for Jordan Cole, the temperature seemed to rise all at once. Not from the plane's vents, but from the sudden shift in attention, in suspicion. One moment he had been just another passenger, another traveler quietly minding his business in the plush comfort of seat 3A, and the next, it was as if a spotlight had been thrown on him, scorching and invasive. The woman standing before him, flight attendant Denise Winters, exuded a kind of practiced civility, a polished exterior sharpened into something cutting. Her expression was composed, but beneath it simmered something colder than professional decorum. It wasn't concern for order. It was something far older, far uglier. Jordan's hands tightened on the armrests, knuckles whitening slightly. He knew that look. He'd seen it before, at upscale clothing stores where security shadowed him silently. At school, when teachers assumed his good grades were a surprise. But here, 30,000 feet above judgment, he had thought he might be safe. The ticket in his pocket, purchased fairly. The seat assigned. But none of that mattered now because Denise hadn't seen a teenager or a young man ready to take on the world. She had seen a problem. Her voice hadn't risen, but her words cut all the same. "You must be mistaken, sweetie." As if he were a child too naive to understand boarding passes. "You can't just sneak up here." As if he were a thief, not a rightful passenger. The accusation wasn't loud, but its impact echoed. All around him the cabin shifted, not loudly, but unmistakably. A shuffle of papers, a sudden stillness. Conversations dulled. The man across the aisle, pinstripe suit, Rolex flashing, eyed him now like a trespasser, not a peer, and that laughter, sharp, mocking, just behind him, landed like a slap. No one spoke up. No one asked Denise to double-check before making assumptions. No one wondered aloud if maybe, just maybe, the kid in the hoodie belonged. Jordan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. But inside, something cracked. Not with rage, but with shame, confusion, and a kind of despair that settled like sediment in his chest. He had come this far, done everything right. And still, one glance erased all of it, just like that. When Denise walked off, his boarding pass in hand, it wasn't just paper she took, it was dignity. And as he sat there, spine stiff against the seat, eyes fixed on nothing, all he could feel was the weight of eyes that didn't see him. Only what they feared he might be. The boarding pass landed with a flutter against the tray table, the corners curling slightly from Denise's careless toss. The gesture was deliberate in its dismissal, a punctuation mark that said more than her clipped words ever could. "You're not worth an apology." Jordan stared at it. That thin, creased slip of paper was supposed to represent entitlement, a seat earned, not stolen, but now it felt tainted, cheapened, as if her touch had stripped it of legitimacy, leaving only shame behind. He didn't look up when she walked away, heels clicking with officious confidence. He couldn't. His throat was tight, his shoulders rigid with the effort of staying composed. Around him the silence was suffocating, not the calm quiet of travelers settling in, but the heavy, complicit quiet of people who had witnessed and chosen comfort over conscience. No one met his eyes. The man with the newspaper who'd once glanced over now kept his gaze buried in the sports section, pretending nothing had happened. The couple across the aisle murmured to each other in hushed tones, glancing at him out of the corners of their eyes. And behind him, a woman adjusted her seatbelt with slow, deliberate motions, Perhaps out of awkwardness, or maybe because she, like the rest, didn't want to be seen choosing silence. Jordan's fingers hovered over his phone. The urge to reach for something, someone, burned in him. His mother's face, her voice, would have brought comfort. But what would he say? That he was humiliated? That he felt small and exposed, not for something he did, but for who he was. It felt too heavy to text, too raw to share. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. He pulled on his headphones, desperate for an escape, but even that betrayed him. The music was there, sure, notes and lyrics filling his ears, but it couldn't muffle the sound of the flight attendant's condescension echoing in his mind. It couldn't mute the weight of judgment that still hung in the air, thick and sour. It wasn't about the seat. It wasn't even about the flight. It was about the invisible asterisks people attached to his presence. Black, young, hoodie, alone. And the idea that those things, in combination, somehow made luxury inconceivable. That excellence required explanation. That belonging had to be proven again and again, to strangers with no right to demand it. They didn't know he had just bested some of the brightest minds in the country. They didn't know his name would be etched on plaques, or that he was the son of a man whose signature had altered military strategy. But that wasn't the point. Jordan had done everything right, and still, the world had made him feel wrong. That was the deepest cut of all. The wheels kissed the tarmac with a jolt and a rising roar of reverse thrusters, but to Jordan, the touchdown felt less like an arrival and more like an exhale, the first breath he'd fully taken since boarding. The glint of Los Angeles sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, warm and golden, but his chest still held the cold sting of humiliation. He didn't wait for the flight attendant to offer assistance. He rose smoothly, pulled his bag from the overhead bin, and avoided eye contact with everyone around him. His silence was its own armor. The terminal buzzed with energy, businessmen barking into phones, families gathering bags, laughter echoing across polished floors. Jordan walked through it all with measured calm, head high, expression unreadable. But inside, a storm churned. He didn't know what he expected to feel when he saw his father. Relief, maybe. Validation. But even that felt diluted by the quiet ache that had settled into his ribs. And then, just beyond the security glass, he saw him. General Marcus Cole stood tall in full military dress, ribbons precise, posture immaculate, presence commanding. He drew looks without trying. A man shaped by war, by decades of discipline and duty, who now led one of the most formidable defense tech firms in the country. His eyes softened only when they landed on his son. "Son," he said simply, clasping Jordan's shoulder in a firm but familiar grip. "Everything all right?" Jordan hesitated. His instinct was to nod, to brush it off, but the words stuck behind his teeth. He gave the smallest nod anyway. "Yeah, I'm good." Marcus didn't challenge him, but his gaze lingered a moment longer than usual, reading the micro-expressions Jordan tried to hide. The slight tightness in his jaw, the way he clutched his bag like a shield. He didn't press, not yet. Meanwhile, 30 gates and a world away, flight attendant Denise Winters scrolled through her phone in the galley, barely registering the new notification from corporate. PR alert, passenger complaint, high priority. She rolled her eyes, probably another first-class diva with a blog, but then a voice broke through the routine. "Denise, did you check who that kid was?" She looked up at her co-worker, who was holding her phone like it had caught fire. Denise tilted her head, smirking. "Some kid who tried to sneak up here." Her co-worker's face blanched. That wasn't just some kid, that was General Marcus Cole's son. The color drained from Denise's cheeks. The name landed like a gut punch. Coltech, the same company whose encrypted tech their airline had just rolled out last quarter. The company with government contracts worth billions. The man with ties to senators, press outlets, and legal firms with more bite than bark. Denise's breath hitched. She hadn't embarrassed a teenager. She had embarrassed the wrong teenager. The digital world didn't just notice. It ignited. Within minutes of Coltech's statement hitting the company's official channels, the momentum was irreversible. The post was crisp, unapologetic, and direct. It didn't hide behind corporate euphemisms or vague commitments to re-evaluation. It named the harm. It defended the dignity. It made Jordan visible, not as a passive victim, but as the spark in a system overdue for a reckoning. We will not tolerate discrimination, especially when it affects the dignity of our children. Those words traveled, fast, and they struck something deep. By mid-morning, hashtags were trending worldwide. #FirstClassJustice. #Let Jordan sit. #He belongs. Posts flooded timelines. Parents recounting similar humiliations their kids had faced. Professionals sharing stories of being mistaken for assistants or imposters in boardrooms, classrooms, airports. What happened on that plane wasn't rare, but it was finally seen. Someone had filmed it all. A grainy, vertical video surfaced. The angle was shaky, the audio imperfect, but the content was clear. Denise's tone, her condescension, Jordan's quiet insistence. The moment she snatched his ticket, the moment no one intervened. Outrage poured in. Commentators on every major network dissected the footage. Civil rights leaders called for accountability. Celebrities lent their voices. Athletes wore "He Belongs" shirts to interviews. The airline scrambled to issue an apology. Their words were careful, laden with rehearsed regret and a promise of internal review. But it was too late for subtlety. Denise Winters was suspended by the afternoon. But none of it mattered more than the moment he spoke. Jordan sat beneath the studio lights with the composure of someone decades older. Dressed simply in a navy blazer, hands clasped in his lap, he didn't flinch when the interviewer asked what he'd felt in that moment on the plane. "I wasn't angry because she thought I didn't belong," he said, voice level. "I was angry because no one else stood up and said otherwise." No theatrics, no dramatics, just truth, sharpened by clarity. "If I stayed silent," he added, "that silence would speak louder than the insult." Across living rooms, phones, classrooms, and break rooms, people paused, listened, understood. What Jordan gave wasn't just a statement, it was permission. For every teenager told to shrink themselves. For every parent tired of explaining why their child has to be twice as good. For every adult still carrying the sting of being othered in spaces they'd rightfully earned. He gave them words. He gave them fire. And when he stood, the world stood a little taller with him,